On the evening of February 1st, 1781, Charles Cornwallis stood at the smoldering ruins of his own supply wagons and made a decision that would eventually cost Britain the American Revolution. He had just ordered his men to burn them, not enemy wagons, his own. Food, tents, spare equipment, the medical supplies his men would need in the weeks ahead, the reserve ammunition that any sane commander keeps within reach for the battles he has not yet fought, all of it going up in flames by his own command in a cold Carolina field because he had made a calculation that the only way to catch Nathanael Greene's retreating army was to strip his force down to nothing and run. He was right about the tactics. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else.
Because Greene was not running away from Cornwallis. Greene was running towards something. Every mile of that retreat was a mile closer to the ground he had chosen, the reinforcements he had arranged, and the trap he had been building since December. The chase Cornwallis was so eager to begin was not a pursuit, it was an invitation. And Britain's most aggressive, most capable, most feared field commander in the American theater accepted it with both hands. What happened over the following 6 weeks across the rivers and roads of North Carolina in the dead of winter, ending on a hilltop outside a small settlement called Guilford Courthouse, is one of the most perfectly constructed strategic traps in the history of the Revolutionary War. It did not begin with a battle plan. It began with a general who understood something about his opponent that his opponent did not understand about himself.
The general everyone feared. To understand what Greene accomplished, you have to understand what he was dealing with. Charles Cornwallis, Lieutenant General, 2nd Earl Cornwallis, was not simply the best British field commander in America in 1781. He was, by most contemporary assessments on both sides, one of the finest operational generals Britain had produced in a generation. He had fought at Long Island, where Howe's magnificent flanking maneuver had shattered Washington's position on the heights of Guam. He had driven Washington's retreating army across New Jersey in 1776 with a speed and aggression that kept the Continental Army perpetually off balance. He had won at Brandywine, at Camden, at Fishing Creek. Camden, in August of 1780, had been his masterpiece up to that point. He had engaged Horatio Gates, the American general who had received most of the credit for Saratoga while men like Morgan and Arnold did most of the fighting, and destroyed him so completely that Gates fled the field on horseback and kept riding for 60 miles before stopping. Camden was the worst American defeat of the entire war, worse even than the fall of Charleston 3 months earlier, and Cornwallis had engineered it with a combination of tactical aggression and battlefield control that left British commanders in New York deeply impressed.
After Camden, the southern colonies looked like they were finished. Cornwallis held South Carolina. British forces held Georgia. North Carolina seemed open. Virginia beckoned. The strategic picture from a British perspective in the autumn of 1780 looked like the beginning of the end. Washington sent Nathanael Greene to fix it. Greene arrived at Charlotte, North Carolina in December 1780 to find, as Morgan had found before Cowpens, barely an army at all. Fewer than 1,500 men in any condition to fight. Hungry, undersupplied, demoralized by Camden, spread across a countryside that was actively hostile in many districts, contested in most. He had no cavalry worth the name, no secure supply base, no clear defensive ground within easy reach. He had something better. He had an understanding of the strategic situation that cut through the immediate military picture to the deeper reality underneath.
The deeper reality was this. Cornwallis's position in the Carolinas was only as strong as his ability to control the population, and his ability to control the population depended entirely on the visible presence of British military power in the countryside. The moment that presence was challenged, the moment American forces demonstrated they could operate freely in areas Cornwallis claimed to control, the loyalist population that Britain was counting on would become considerably less loyal. Cornwallis needed to keep moving, to keep demonstrating control, to keep pursuing and catching and destroying American forces before they could consolidate. His aggressive temperament and his track record made patience almost impossible for him anyway. Standing still and consolidating was not how Cornwallis operated. It was not how he had achieved everything he had achieved. Greene understood that this was not a weakness he needed to exploit. It was the entire mechanism of the trap.
The retreat that was never a retreat. On December 16, 1780, Greene made the same decision Nathanael Greene's predecessor had called insane when Washington contemplated it in the North. He split his already tiny army. He sent Daniel Morgan west with about 600 men, the detachment that would fight at Cowpens 3 weeks later, the force that would annihilate Banastre Tarleton and destroy 86% of a British light corps in under an hour on a cattle field in South Carolina. The rest of Greene's force, about 1,100 men, he kept with him and moved east toward the PD River. The division of forces accomplished two things simultaneously. It put American troops in two places at once, forcing Cornwallis to either divide his own force or leave one American column operating freely in his rear. And it created the conditions for Cowpens, which in turn created the conditions for everything that followed. After Cowpens, Cornwallis faced a choice that was really no choice at all given who he was. He could consolidate, acknowledge the damage Tarleton's defeat had done, and spend the winter rebuilding his capacity in South Carolina, or he could pursue Morgan's force, recover the prisoners Tarleton had lost, and reassert British dominance in the region with the speed and aggression that had defined his career. He burned his wagons and pursued. What began on February 1st, 1781 and lasted nearly 2 weeks entered American military history as the race to the Dan. Greene's combined force, Morgan's men reunited with the main army, ran north toward the Dan River on the Virginia border. Cornwallis chased them. The distances were murderous. The roads were winter mud. The rivers were running cold and fast. Greene's army crossed the Dan on February 14th by the narrowest of margins. He had pre-positioned boats on the Virginia side of the river weeks earlier, while planning a retreat he had not yet begun. That detail is worth holding. He had arranged the boats before the pursuit started. He had thought ahead to the crossing before the race began. Cornwallis arrived at the Dan to find the boats gone and the American army safe on the Virginia side. He had chased Greene 250 miles in 2 weeks, burned his own supplies to do it, and arrived at a river he could not cross with an army that was cold, hungry, exhausted, and now dangerously far from its base in South Carolina. Greene rested his men, took on reinforcements from the Virginia militia, and turned around.
The ground he chose. Guilford Courthouse sat on a low hill in what is now Greensboro, North Carolina. In February and March of 1781, it was a small settlement, a courthouse, a few buildings, at the intersection of roads that connected the back country of North Carolina to the rest of the state. Greene chose it for reasons that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who had studied Morgan's thinking at Cowpens 6 weeks earlier. The ground sloped in ways that would force an attacking force to advance uphill through successive terrain features. A cleared farm field opened the approach. Behind it, a tree line. Behind that, more open ground. Behind that, another tree line, and the final position on the hill. He arranged his forces in 3 lines. Morgan had used 3 lines at Cowpens. Greene had not only studied the result, he had been corresponding with Morgan throughout the Southern campaign and had absorbed the thinking behind the formation so thoroughly that he reproduced its essential logic on this new ground. The first line, the militia from North Carolina, went in the cleared farm field at the bottom of the slope. Their orders were identical in spirit to the orders Morgan had given his militia at Cowpens. Fire 2 shots and withdraw. Do not stand and trade volleys with British regulars.
Do not try to hold the ground. Fire, hurt them, and give way in an organized manner to the second line. The second line, Virginia militia with more experience and steadier nerves than the North Carolinians, went in the first tree line behind the farm field. Their job was to receive the retiring North Carolinians, let them pass through the gaps in the formation, and then deliver their own volley fire into a British advance that had already been disordered by the first line and would now be advancing uphill through broken ground. The third line, the Continental Regulars, the 1st and 2nd Maryland, the Virginia Continentals, went on the hill at the top, in the woods around the courthouse itself. These were the professionals, the men who would stand and fight when the militia lines had done their work and fallen back. They were the anvil, exactly as they had been at Cowpens. On both flanks, cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's Dragoons on one side, Light Horse Harry Lee's Legion on the other. The same closing force that had sealed the trap at Cowpens was present here in expanded form, waiting for the moment when the British advance had been softened enough for the hammer to fall. Greene had not just borrowed Morgan's template, he had refined it. The ground was better suited to the three-line approach than Cowpens had been. The reinforcements he had gathered in Virginia meant his third line was stronger, his flanking cavalry more capable. He had a larger force than Morgan, better positioned on ground of his choosing. He was ready. He did not have to wait long.
Cornwallis arrives.
On the morning of March 15th, 1781, Cornwallis marched his army toward Guilford Courthouse. He had roughly 1,900 men. Greene had approximately 4,400. The numerical disparity was the largest the British faced in any significant engagement of the Southern campaign, and Cornwallis knew it. He knew Greene had reinforcements. His intelligence, while imperfect, had given him a reasonable picture of what was waiting on that hill. He attacked anyway. This is the moment where understanding who Cornwallis was becomes essential. A more cautious commander, a commander whose career had been built on defensive competence or methodical siege work, might have hesitated, might have looked at the numbers and decided to wait for a better opportunity, to find a way to force Greene onto less favorable ground, to deny him the defensive engagement he was clearly seeking.
Cornwallis was not that commander. He was the commander who had chased Gates off the field at Camden by attacking with ferocious directness before the Americans could organize. He was the commander who had burned his own supply wagons to keep moving when any sane man would have stopped. He had built his career and his reputation on the proposition that British regulars attacking with aggression and discipline could overcome numerical disadvantage and positional difficulty through sheer professional force. He was right about that proposition more often than he was wrong. He had been right at Camden. He had been right at Brandywine. He had been right at more engagements than it is easy to count. At Guilford Courthouse, the proposition walked him directly into the mouth of a trap built specifically around his certainty in it. He sent his force forward in 3 columns, the Guards on the right, the Hessians and Highlanders in the center, the light infantry and Jaegers on the left, as professional an assault formation as the British Army in America could produce, advancing across the farm field toward the first American line, with the bayonet discipline and measured pace that had broken American formations from Long Island to Camden. At the edge of the farm field, 1,500 North Carolina militiamen waited.
The field, the trees, the hill. What happened over the next 2 hours at Guilford Courthouse was simultaneously a British tactical success and a British strategic catastrophe. Cornwallis took the ground. He paid a price for it that his army could not recover from in a campaign he could not afford to lose for a position that gave him nothing of lasting value. The North Carolina militia fired their volleys. Some of them delivered 2 shots as ordered and withdrew in reasonable order. Some of them, as militia always might, delivered 1 shot or no shots and left rather faster than Greene had hoped. But enough of them held long enough for the first line to do its fundamental job: disorder the British advance, thin the attacking formations, force the redcoats to dress their lines while taking casualties, and slow the momentum that Cornwallis was counting on. The British pressed through the farm field and into the first tree line where the Virginia militia waited. Here, the fighting was harder and longer. The Virginia men were steadier than their North Carolina counterparts, better positioned in the broken ground of the wood line, and the British advance through the trees lost the parade ground formation that made it most dangerous. Men slipped on wet leaves, units separated in the timber, officers lost sight of adjacent formations. The Virginia militia ultimately gave way as well, as planned, though not as cleanly as the plan preferred. They fell back toward the Continental line on the hill. And here, Cornwallis's advance ran into something it had not yet encountered in the Southern campaign: American regulars in good ground who were not going to move. The 1st and 2nd Maryland, veterans of a dozen engagements, formed across the crest of the hill and opened fire into a British force that had been advancing uphill through broken ground for the better part of an hour, taking casualties at every tree line, losing unit cohesion with every 100 yards of difficult terrain. The British came on anyway, because British regulars in 1781 came on regardless, and the fighting around the courthouse itself became a close-quarters engagement of a ferocity that multiple witnesses on both sides described as the most intense combat of the entire Southern campaign. At one point, a portion of the British Guards broke through the Continental line and appeared behind the American position. For several minutes, it seemed possible that the British had found the gap that would unravel Greene's formation. The 1st Maryland counterattacked and pushed them back in fighting that went to the bayonet and stayed there. On the flanks, William Washington's cavalry and light horse Harry Lee's legion were fighting their own brutal engagements against the British flank guards, preventing the kind of envelopment that had sealed the destruction at Cowpens. Cornwallis made a decision in that moment that has been debated by every military historian who has studied the battle. He ordered his artillery to fire grape shot into the melee, into the close quarters fighting where British soldiers and American soldiers were intermingled, into the brawl around the courthouse where the Guards and the 1st Maryland were fighting hand to hand. The grape shot hit both sides. It hit his own men. He made the calculation that disordering the fight was worth killing some of his own soldiers, because the alternative, the 1st Maryland pushing his guards back entirely, was worse. The grape shot broke the immediate crisis. The American line stabilized, then began to pull back in an organized withdrawal that Greene had ordered when he assessed that the battle had achieved its essential purpose. Cornwallis held the hill.
What winning looked like. The British Army was in possession of the field at Guilford Courthouse by mid-afternoon on March 15, 1781. By the formal military accounting of the 18th century, that made it a British victory. Cornwallis had taken the ground. Greene had retreated. Cornwallis held the field, his wounded and approximately 532 casualties. 28% of his entire force killed or wounded in a single afternoon. Of the 1,900 men he had brought to Guilford Courthouse, more than 1 in 4 was dead or incapacitated before sunset. Among the officer corps, the losses were devastating and disproportionate. Officers in the British Army led from the front, and the front at Guilford Courthouse had been extraordinarily dangerous. Multiple battalion commanders were hit. The Guards, who had borne the heaviest fighting around the courthouse itself, had lost officers at a rate that would take months to replace. Greene's army retreated intact. He had lost roughly 1,300 men, more than Cornwallis in raw numbers, but from a force more than twice the size. His Continentals were shaken but unbroken. His cavalry was operational. He had ammunition, supplies, food. He had, critically, the organizational structure to absorb his losses and continue the campaign.
Cornwallis had the field and a broken army. Charles James Fox, the opposition leader in the British Parliament, delivered the verdict on Guilford Courthouse in terms that no British minister could effectively refute. Standing in the House of Commons, Fox said, "Another such victory would ruin the British Army." He was not being rhetorical, he was being precise. Cornwallis could not stay at Guilford Courthouse. He had no supplies, insufficient ammunition, and 532 casualties requiring care his medical staff could barely provide. He retreated to Wilmington on the North Carolina coast, 175 miles away to resupply and refit.
The interior of North Carolina, which he had marched through twice in the preceding weeks and claimed to control, was effectively abandoned. Greene did not follow him to Wilmington. Greene turned south, back into South Carolina, and began the campaign that would systematically dismantle every British position in the Carolinas, while Cornwallis sat on the coast trying to figure out what to do next.
The decision that ended everything. Cornwallis did next, sitting in Wilmington in April 1781, is the hinge point on which the entire war turned. He had options. He could go south and support the British garrisons in South Carolina and Georgia that Greene was methodically dismantling. He could wait for instructions from Sir Henry Clinton in New York. He could consolidate in North Carolina and try to rebuild the capacity to contest the interior. He chose to march north into Virginia. The decision was not entirely irrational. Virginia was the logistical heart of the American war effort in the South. If it could be disrupted, its supply lines cut, its resources denied to Greene, the Southern campaign might yet be recovered. And the aggressive, forward momentum temperament that defined everything Cornwallis had ever done made standing still in Wilmington feel like defeat, even if the strategic mathematics suggested patience.
Clinton was furious. He had not authorized the Virginia campaign. He had expected Cornwallis to return south and stabilize the Carolinas. He sent increasingly frantic letters demanding clarification, demanding compliance, demanding the kind of coordinated action that two generals who had lost faith in each other are structurally incapable of producing. Cornwallis marched into Virginia anyway. He raided effectively through the summer of 1781. Tarleton, recovered from Cowpens, led cavalry deep into Virginia's interior and nearly captured Governor Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. British forces burned warehouses and disrupted supply lines, and demonstrated once again that Cornwallis in the field was a formidable and dangerous opponent. None of it mattered strategically. Greene was methodically taking South Carolina. The British posts at 96, at Camden, at Fort Mott, at Fort Granby fell one after another to a combination of siege, maneuver, and partisan pressure. By the end of the summer of 1781, British control of the Carolinas had contracted to a few coastal positions. And then Clinton ordered Cornwallis to establish a defensive post on the Virginia coast. He chose Yorktown.
From Guilford to Yorktown, the line from Guilford Courthouse to Yorktown runs straighter than most military cause and effect sequences in history. At Guilford, Cornwallis won a tactical victory that cost him the capacity to maintain his campaign in the Carolinas. He retreated to Wilmington. He marched to Virginia to recover momentum he never quite recaptured. He ended up at Yorktown on a peninsula where a combined American and French force surrounded him, where the French fleet sealed the Chesapeake against British naval relief, and where on October 19, 1781, he surrendered 8,000 men, the largest British force captured in the entire war. He was sick on the day of the surrender and sent a subordinate to carry his sword to Washington, who in turn directed the British commander to give it to his own second, General Lincoln, in recognition of the humiliation Lincoln had suffered surrendering Charleston to the British the year before. The symbolism closed a loop that had opened at Guilford Courthouse 7 months earlier. The army that had won every battle in the South, that had driven Gates from Camden and Washington from Long Island, and Morgan from the field before Cowpens, that had burned its own wagons to pursue Greene across North Carolina, that had taken Guilford Courthouse at 28% casualties and still called it a victory, that army was finished. The war effectively ended with that surrender, though the peace treaty would take another 2 years to complete. Lord North, the Prime Minister, reportedly paced the floor, repeating, "It is all over," when the news reached London. The King wanted to continue. Parliament declined. The political will to keep paying for a war that had just produced Yorktown had run out. Greene, characteristically, got less credit than he deserved. Washington became the face of the victory at Yorktown because Washington was there and Greene was not. He was still fighting in the Carolinas, still systematically dismantling British positions, still running the campaign that had made Yorktown possible,
by stripping Cornwallis of the base he needed to sustain himself in Virginia. The Marquis de Lafayette, who commanded American forces in Virginia and had done genuinely useful work containing Cornwallis in the months before Yorktown, received considerable credit. Henry Knox received credit for the artillery. Rochambeau received credit for the French regulars. Washington received credit for everything. Greene received a gold medal from Congress and was quietly acknowledged by the officers who understood what had actually happened. Light Horse Harry Lee, who had ridden with him through the entire Southern campaign, wrote afterward that the Carolinas had been saved by a general who had never fought a battle he did not lose, nor conducted a campaign he did not win. It is the most precise description of Greene's achievement that anyone ever wrote. He lost Guilford Courthouse and won the war in the South.
The question that sits underneath all of this is the one that Cornwallis himself spent the rest of his life, a long and otherwise distinguished career, avoiding fully answering. He did not walk into the trap at Guilford Courthouse through stupidity or ignorance. He was an intelligent, experienced, tactically sophisticated commander who understood what he was doing and did it anyway. He walked into it because his entire career had taught him that British regulars attacking with controlled aggression could overcome almost any disadvantage of ground or numbers or position. He had data, he had Brandywine, he had Camden, he had a dozen smaller engagements that said the same thing. When the evidence of your career contradicts the warning of a particular tactical situation, it is the career that usually wins the argument inside a commander's head.
Greene had studied that career. He had built a position not designed to stop Cornwallis. He knew he could not stop Cornwallis, but designed to make Cornwallis pay the maximum possible price for the ground he was going to take anyway. 3 lines that exhausted the attack's momentum before it reached the professionals. Flanking cavalry that prevented envelopment. A 3rd-line position that could absorb what the first 2 lines had weakened. The trap was not a trap Cornwallis could not see. It was a trap he walked into because the alternative was standing still, and standing still was not who he was. That is the most elegant kind of strategic trap. Not the kind built around an opponent's ignorance, the kind built around an opponent's strengths.
The courthouse today. The battlefield at Guilford Courthouse is a national military park in Greensboro, North Carolina. The ground has been partially restored to its 1781 condition. Trees where the tree lines were, open fields where the militia formed, the rise of the hill where the Continentals held their final position. There are monuments to Greene and to the Maryland line and to the Virginia militia. There is a monument to Cornwallis that notes, with the kind of diplomatic restraint military parks employ, that the British commander won a costly victory. The courthouse itself is long gone. The settlement that gave the battle its name barely survived into the 19th century. Greensboro grew up around and past it, leaving the battle site as a preserved island of 1781 ground in a modern city. On a quiet afternoon, you can walk the line of the North Carolina militia and look down the slope toward where the British came from. The farm field is smaller than you expect. The distance from the tree line to the British approach is not large. In the 10 minutes it took the British regulars to cross that ground under fire, everything that followed became possible. Cornwallis won the field and lost the war. Greene lost the battle and saved the revolution. The ground is the same. Only the understanding of what happened on it has changed.